Dedicated, flexible, independent, confident, compassionate, outstanding Nurse Corps officers. Navy nurses in the White House Medical Unit, on duty and out of the spotlight. When thinking about a career as a Navy nurse, an assignment in the White House does not immediately come to mind. However, when the President of the United States travels, a military nurse isn't far from his side. Duty with the White House Medical Unit is a tri-service mission. The President's medical staff comes from the Navy, Army, and Air Force. Navy nurses in the White House Medical Unit are all licensed, registered nurses and on active duty status. Assignments on the presidential staff typically run from 2 to 4 years. For the Navy nurse, care for the President, Vice President, and First Family are job one.
And I remember that they would go the extra mile, not only to look after the President, but they're in the White House Medical Unit to take care of others as well. And they were career professionals. They knew trauma. They knew how to take care of all kinds of injuries.
They did an outstanding job of providing my health care, as well as caring for my family and the rest of my staff assigned to the White House.
We had a clinic in the old executive office building, which was right adjacent to the main White House complex, still on the 18 acres just across the parking lot. We see everybody on the 18 acres there, including Secret Service, White House communications, any military personnel, visitors, dignitaries.
Nurses officially joined the White House Medical Unit staff in the 1950s. Before 1952, the President's personal physician provided medical care. A civilian registered nurse, Genevieve Harrell, served from 1952 to 1977. In 1961, Navy nurses joined the White House Medical Unit staff. The other uniformed services joined in 1971.
The evolution of the White House nurse was that up until President John F. Kennedy, there had not been really a medical department per se at the White House. The President brought a civilian physician, brought his own physician with him, and because of Bethesda's close proximity, one of the nurses was actually put on temporary duty to the White House. Nurses did not travel with the President at that time. She would just come on a PRN basis or an as-needed basis.
The hiring process for White House Navy nurses has evolved over the years. In the beginning, the selection process was secretive. Over time, nomination criteria were developed as a key element in a formal selection process.
When I was a detailer, it was never a position that was ever marketed. The opportunities, I think, were there for everybody, whether they knew it or not, because we had the criteria and we would screen the records and send our best qualified over. But as the years went on, we had more and more nurses who had been at the White House and who are now back out in the nursing community. The word spreads, and now we have people who are very much interested in applying. They could always do that, let us know that they were interested, and then we would go ahead and take a look at their record.
I got a call from the nursing office that my name was on a list to be interviewed down at the White House, and I wasn't even sure what they were talking about. I have no clue to this day how my name got on that list.
I look back on it now as a lieutenant commander talking to an admiral at the White House, and I said, I'm not really sure. I think that I really need to meet you and your staff personally before I make a decision, because we'll be working so closely together. He sighed over the phone and said, well, I really can't fly everyone back to Washington that I want to interview. And I said, I certainly understand that, but I think in all fairness to both of us, I need to do that. My tickets were in the mail immediately. I was flown back to Washington for a personal interview.
I was stationed in Great Lakes when I was tasked to do the interview, but I was on temporary additional duty in Brunswick, Maine. And I had just arrived, and I got a message that my boss had called and needed me to call back. So I had just arrived, and I called him, and I was a little irritable, and I said, I just got here. What could you possibly need me for when I haven't done anything yet? And he said, because you have to be in Washington tomorrow morning for an interview. And I said, for what? And he said, you have an interview at the White House. Again, for what? He said, for a job. Now, in the military, you don't interview for jobs. You're just assigned. You just go. So he said, you're being considered for a White House nurse position. And that was the first time I was aware that there was such a position.
A nomination on my behalf was submitted sometime in 1996. You were not allowed at that time to ask to go. It wasn't an advertised position. It required a nomination, and from that nomination, selected candidates were developed on behalf of the Navy and submitted to the White House for consideration. So I was nominated in 1996 by my command for the position, and from there I filled an application out and did a statement of why I thought I would fit well in that particular assignment. And I crossed my fingers and I waited to see if the White House would invite me out for an interview, and I was very fortunate they did. I got the job.
In order to serve as a White House Navy nurse, you must meet both professional and personal requirements set by both the Navy and the White House Medical Unit.
We received a notification from the White House that they would like us to send them some nominees. Then we would scour the records, take a look, come up with what we felt was the best qualified for the position. Then we would submit those names to the White House, and then the White House would review the records, get back in touch with us, let us know just exactly who it is that they would like to have called in for a further interview.
The packages initially go to BUMED, to the Special Assignment Office there, and they're reviewed, and they do a kind of chop on it, and they decide who might be good candidates to actually send to the White House for an interview process.
We knew that they were very much interested in somebody who was physically fit and was going to be able to pass the physical fitness tests and be able to present a good military appearance, and that they would be able to be good communicators. They could articulate well, that they would be able to interact with the other members of the White House staff without any drive for personal recognition, that they would fit in with the other members of the team.
The selection process for the Navy nurses is actually a pretty set up process. We try to remove the mystery from it. There are certain guidelines they have to fulfill. They have to be credentialed nurses, RNs, CCRNs, so critical care nurses. We also looked at nurses who were emergency room nurses because we wanted that type of capability. They have to have a flawless clinical record. They have to be outstanding naval officers. The nurses that we also like selecting are ones who've done different tours. They've been operational, they've gone overseas, they've done things more beyond the hospital setting. And once they fulfill that criteria on paper, they're invited to the White House to interview.
The requirement for an overseas duty station was dropped because we could not get as many people overseas as we would have liked to as a junior officer.
I think the Navy nurses were so wonderful, and they had a kind of a code they lived by, I think. Available but not visible. That's what they always told us. And they were always there. We knew they were always there. But they were non-intrusive and really wonderful.
I would venture to say that if you look at a lot of file footage and coverage of the President's movement on a daily basis, you'll rarely, if ever, see a medical person, but we're always there. We're close enough to the President so that in the medical emergency, the Secret Service moves us along with him so that we can provide definitive medical treatment.
The nature of the job is that you are competing all the time for a fixed amount of time with the principal. So whether it was President Reagan or President Bush or Mrs. Reagan or Mrs. Bush, no matter what you were doing with them, you might be in the middle of a physical, or you might be in the middle of taking a blood pressure for them, and somebody needs to speak to them right now. And you were always having to sort of draw a line and say, right now is a time when they need to be having their blood pressure checked, or having their allergy shot, or having their physical or something like that, and this is going to have to wait. And so you had to be confident enough to draw that line and sort of stick by it.
What we did in the medical unit is what they call protective medical support. Wherever the president goes, the doctor and the nurse would follow, and we would shadow him, just like in that entourage with Secret Service.
So a physician is always assigned to the president. The nature of a nurse as a professional, we are nurses historically are not the people who make diagnoses for diseases. We don't treat disease. We provide care, and we are the experts for processes, if you will. Whereas a physician and a physician assistant, they provide a diagnosis. They diagnose diseases and decide on a medical treatment. It is the nurse corps officer's responsibility to take that diagnosis and to execute appropriately the clinical dynamics associated with them.
So it was a very demanding job at times. And when we were on the road, you were on 24/7.
Prior to a trip, the nurse assesses the medical resources of the area to be visited, in addition to the environment of the foreign destination. Of particular concern are preparations for emergency response and epidemic diseases that may require preventive measures. Working in close consultation with a White House doctor, the nurse develops, based on available resources, detailed plans for medical care.
Contingency planning is a very big role, part of the role of the Navy nurse. It never used to be. I probably was the first, I know I was the first nurse that went out as the contingency planner for the medical unit, and we planned the entire trip. As far as contingency planning for the medical unit, that means meeting our host country's embassy personnel, the medical unit there, and they would advise us what local physicians and hospitals we should at least look at. And from there, I would meet with each of those hospitals, the personnel, and ask for a tour of the facilities, primarily their intensive care unit and their emergency room, because that's what we would be utilizing at the time. Then I would work with the Secret Service and the communications people to set up a particular contingency plan. Now, as a nurse, I would also call back to the physician, to the president, and discuss with him what my recommendations are, so that he would always have final say as the physician.
Because a lot of the requirements of the Navy White House nurse is the emergency action part of the job, where you go to a foreign country with the White House team, you find the hospital that they're going to use, you interview the people at the hospital, you set up the game plan. So if that president is injured or killed or something tragic happens at that trip, the White House nurse has the game cards. He or she knows where we go, how we medevac them, what happens. They are a key player.
My job as a White House nurse was to be Velcroed to the president and follow his movements if the president took a hit to the chest, a bullet to the chest, or a bullet somewhere, that I could do my job as a pre-hospital provider. Once he is taken to the hospital staff is going to pick up. You're going to let them do what they need to do, and you're going to be there to be the support for them and for the president. Taking care of the contingent on a foreign location was a big concern of mine, because you are the sole medical provider for that 1,000+ people that may be at the location site. And going to a remote location makes it even a little more stressful.
It was contingency planning, and that afforded itself to coordination with multiple entities. One entity, and probably one of the most important, is the security dynamics. So we worked very, very closely with the United States Secret Service, a highly professional organization. We also worked very closely abroad with our embassies and host nations for medical coverage and support. And then with our other military components, because there are certain assets that need to be moved into place if certain levels of medical capabilities don't exist in certain countries. There are occasions when the president travels or when you're planning a trip for him that the security concerns compete with the medical concerns. In most cases, anytime there was a security concern, we would sit down and we would work out the logistics, and we would find a compromising solution to make it work and to provide the highest care possible to the president and his family.
At all times, nurses carry medical supplies and equipment that enable them to deal with every conceivable medical emergency.
We laugh because the nurses, you know, the people would think that, oh, you're a White House nurse, it's a glamorous job, you fly in Air Force One all the time, you wear nice suits, and it's further from the truth. I wish I had pictures of the nurses in the rain, soaking wet, carrying their 40-pound medical bags and lugging these bags, lugging containers of blood that we would bring overseas.
As soon as we left the White House, I was responsible for carrying 2 pieces of equipment. I had a bag that had medication in it, and a stethoscope, and a blood pressure cuff, and some other examination equipment that I needed, an otoscope to look in ears and eyes. And then in the other heavy case I carried was a respirator in case I needed it with oxygen and a way to deliver oxygen in an emergency.
The nurses carried a separate medical support bag, and a lot of it is your basic trauma gear. You know, the oxygen was carried by a separate FAT kit, first aid trauma kit that the agents carried, but the nurse had essentially bandages, dressings, ice packs, but also a small mini pharmacy that they carried. They carried airway equipment, a laryngoscope in case they needed to intubate, a face mask. I've had the privilege of serving 3 presidents, George Sr., President Clinton, and George Jr. They all use the medical unit as a family. You're sort of the family in that sense. And the nurses are sort of treated like daughters or sons, but they're sort of like their family because they know the family so close. And, you know, we always think of the president as powerful and, you know, just, you know, incredible position, but we see them as humans. We see them when they're sick, when they're not feeling good, when they're not campaigning.
And on one occasion in particular, I believe we were in Arizona, and a motorcycle cop had an accident, and so that I was on duty, and I was called to go check on the cop. And in order to get the ambulance to the scene, the motorcade needed to keep moving to get out of the way. And so they proceeded and had gone on to the airport, and I thought, well, I guess I'll have to catch them in the next city because they're not going to wait for me. And by the time I worked with the paramedics and had taken care of the officer and made sure he was safe, and I got to the airport, Air Force One was there, and Secret Service said, hey, the president made sure we weren't going to leave you behind, and so they waited. And that was very, very kind.
I can remember also a time when I was asked to see Mrs. Thatcher was visiting in Washington, and she had had a cold, and she was staying over at Blair House across the street. So they had called over and asked if someone could come over and see her. So I went over and spent some time with Mrs. Thatcher and examined her and gave her some lozenges and things. She had a sore throat, and she was so pleasant and so just a delightful lady. And when I went back to the White House, President Reagan said to me, "Did you meet Mrs. Thatcher?" And I said, "Yes, I did, and it's so exciting to meet somebody really famous." And he sort of looked crestfallen, and I said, "But I see you every day. You know, I'm used to you. It's nice to see somebody who I've never ever seen in real life before." So he was sort of taken aback by that. I was with President Reagan when he made the speech in Berlin about Mr. Gorbachev take down this wall. I was standing right behind him.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So I know what was going on in world history at that time, and I was there and I was part of it. And that's certainly something that that I will remember forever and will be really important to me forever.
The handshake of Anwar Sadat and President Carter and President Begin, and they were solidifying the peace accords, and it was done on the north lawn of the White House. And again, we wanted to make sure that there was medical coverage readily available and not seen. And so if you see any of the pictures, yes, I was behind one of the hedge bushes, but very adjacent to the event.
Another trip I remember was doing an advance to Rome. President Clinton was going to meet with the Pope at the Vatican, and that was another security issue in and of itself, because you can imagine the Pope has a lot of security as well, and none of the medical staff or the personal staff thought we would meet the Pope or we'd even be in the room with the Pope. But at the very last minute, the President brought all of us up and introduced each one of us personally to the Pope. And that was another amazing event.
When Clinton was campaigning in '96, he was doing his big cross-country campaign on the bus, and we would go to sites that were very hot that summer, and he would be out on podium campaigning away, and the nurse and I would be behind stage. Well, if someone in the crowd in front of him would pass out in front of Clinton, he would stop his speech. He would stop, and he would point, and it says, "Do you need help? You know, do you need medical care?" And everybody would look. He says, "Well, I'm sending my medical team to you." So we would go, "Oh, that's the nurses."
And there were several instances where people in the crowd required routine or emergency medical attention. The nurses always responded quickly, efficiently, and they never panicked. They were stellar naval officers and incredible professionals.
I actually had an opportunity to meet President Mandela during his last reign in office, and of historic significance. He took President Clinton on a trip to Robbins Island, which is where he was imprisoned for many, many years. And it was just very, very interesting to follow he and the president as he explained personally to the president his experiences during his imprisonment, the time that he was there, and to physically look at the cell where he lived and listen to him talk about the food that he ate and the quarries and the things of that nature. So that trip to Africa was a life-altering experience, and I don't think that I will ever experience anything like that again. I'll always carry that away with me.
It really wasn't until John F. Kennedy was assassinated that they actually, Secret Service started looking at, we need to have an organized medical unit. And they started the rudimentary organization of a unit for the president for medical care.
Anytime that a threat is made against the president, whether it comes to fruition or not, we would study it to learn from it so that lessons learned could be used for future preventive activity. So what would happen is, I was not stationed at the White House at the time that President Reagan was shot in 1981, but as part of our training, we would view that tape and look and see what could have been done better, what could have been done differently, why did it happen the way it happened, and use that. And not only attempts against President Reagan or President Bush, but we studied attempts against all world leaders. For example, after President Kennedy was shot, no president rides in an open car. After President Reagan was shot, no president arrives in an outdoor venue. So they no longer pull up to the curb and walk into a building, which when he was shot by John Hinckley.
At that point in time, it was not a part of the medical unit's mission to travel with the president when he traveled inside of the Beltway on his daily trips. So there were no medical support with him.
The personal challenges are probably the hardest.
Some of the challenges of the job included the fact that because you were out of the area so much, you didn't stay in touch with your friends and your colleagues from prior duty stations, that I had very little time at home. You know, you couldn't predict when you were going to be home or where or for how long. So it was difficult to make plans. You couldn't plan on a vacation with friends or something like that. Making a trip, those kinds of things became really challenging.
The United States Navy has played a critical role in attending to the health care needs of the President, the Vice President, the First Family, and the White House staff. For Navy nurses, the most rewarding aspect of service in the White House Medical Unit is the knowledge that they are making a positive difference in the First Family's health care.
It was reassuring to know that a nurse was always available. For example, when I fell and tore 90% of my quadricep muscle, a Navy nurse was right at my side while I made my way back to Washington for knee surgery. They provided nursing care from the time of my injury through my rehab to my recovery.
I think the biggest honor that the President pays to us in the medical unit is when he comes through my office door on the ground floor of the White House, he sighs, because he doesn't have to perform as president. He can be a guy who's not feeling good. And the nurses that we had are incredibly compassionate.
This makes all the sacrifice, both personal and professional, worthwhile.
And they serve the presidency, but much more important, they serve their country in an honorable fashion.
It's a real privilege to be chosen.
To sit in a motorcade and not watch it go by, but actually be in it and see the crowds on the outside and see people's reaction, and then to see world leaders on the inside circle and see and hear conversations and politics as it plays out was an amazing experience.
But a very small, close-knit unit, tri-service, and we work very well together, and we execute the mission to the very best of our abilities. But it's not our job to be there in the spotlight. We're there to support the mission and not to be a part of the overall visual aspects of the mission. So our presence is there, but we're never seen.
I think what better representative of our military than you look at the medical unit, Army, Navy, Air Force, and you can see the type of people who have come to serve.
I didn't meet in advance with these nurses. I took what I got, and I got the best.